Some families leave behind honor, the Ashfords left behind fear. Their mansion loomed like a tomb, their name whispered as a curse. Tonight, we uncover the scandals, the tragedies, and the chilling secrets that refuse to stay buried. Do you believe in family curses? If you enjoy uncovering history's secrets, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the past. The story of the Ashfords begins long before whispers of curses or scandal. To understand their legacy, we have to go back to the early 1800s, when Virginia's rolling hills were covered in tobacco fields, and fortunes were built not just on land, but on control. The Ashford name first appeared in county ledgers around 1812, attached to a man named Charles Ashford, the family's stern patriarch. Charles was no ordinary landowner. He was cunning, ambitious, and willing to step on anyone to climb higher. He purchased hundreds of acres of fertile land, expanding his estate, while his neighbors struggled. Where others saw limits, Charles saw opportunity, and he had no hesitation in seizing it. But what set the Ashfords apart wasn't just their wealth, it was the fear they inspired. Charles had a reputation for ruthless business dealings. Farmers whispered of neighbors who suddenly lost their land after refusing Charles's offers, only for Ashford's men to take control weeks later. Whether it was clever contracts, backroom deals, or intimidation, one thing was clear. Nobody crossed Charles Ashford and came out unscathed by the 1820s. The Ashfords had become a force in the region. Their tobacco harvests brought in profits that rivaled even some of Virginia's most established families. But Charles wasn't satisfied with wealth alone. He wanted influence. He began courting politicians, attending church with prominent leaders, and investing in town projects. To the public, he played the role of the generous benefactor. But behind closed doors, he ruled his estate like a fortress. The Ashford mansion itself reflected this power. Built in a Gothic style unusual for the time, it towered over the valley like a watchful sentinel. With its high gables, narrow windows, and stone walls, it seemed less like a home and more like a fortress of secrets. Servants lived under strict rules, and the children of the family were rarely seen outside its iron gates. When they did appear, they were pale, serious, and almost rehearsed in their manners, as if they'd been trained not to reveal too much. What's most chilling is how quickly whispers began. Stories spread of strange lights flickering in the manor's upper windows at odd hours. Some claimed to hear cries in the night, carried down the hill on the wind. Farmers avoided traveling near the estate after dark, saying the land itself felt unsettled. And yet, no one dared speak too loudly. Charles Ashford's influence stretched too far, and his pockets were too deep. By the time Charles's eldest son, Nathaniel Ashford, came of age, the family was entrenched in wealth and authority. Nathaniel inherited not just land, but his father's stern manner and hunger for control. He studied law in Richmond, returned with polished manners, and soon became a respected figure in local courts. But while townsfolk praised his charm in public, servants whispered that Nathaniel was colder than stone, with a gaze that seemed to weigh a man's soul. Thus, within just 2 generations, the Ashfords had transformed from ambitious landowners into something larger, a dynasty, cloaked in power and shadow. A family both admired and feared, whose influence reached far beyond their estate. But as history often reminds us, the higher a family rises, the more dangerous the fall. And for the Ashfords, the cracks were already forming beneath the surface of their carefully built empire. If wealth was the Ashford family's crown, then their estate was the throne upon which it rested. Perched high on a hill overlooking the valley, the Ashford Manor was a sight that commanded both awe and dread. Locals said it could be seen from nearly every corner of the town, its silhouette cutting into the horizon like a black scar against the sky. The manor itself was massive stone walls, towering chimneys, and Gothic arches that seemed more suited to a cathedral than a home. The iron gates at its entrance were flanked by statues of angels whose faces had long ago weathered into twisted expressions. And the long, winding drive to the house? Locals called it the Road of Silence, because once you passed through the gates, no sound seemed to carry back out. Inside, the Ashfords lived in opulence. Chandeliers glittered above imported rugs, and portraits of grim ancestors stared down from the walls. Each face bore the same features: sharp eyes, tight lips, and a weight of seriousness that almost seemed alive. Visitors often remarked that the air inside the house was heavy, as though the walls themselves remembered every secret, every whispered argument, every crime. But it wasn't just the grandeur of the estate that kept people talking. It was the sense of secrecy that surrounded it. The children of the Ashford family were rarely seen in town. They were tutored privately within the manor's walls, their pale faces appearing only briefly in church pews or at rare community gatherings. When they did attend, townsfolk noticed how unervingly disciplined they were, answering politely, speaking little, and always watching with those piercing Ashford eyes. Then there were the servants. Many were hired from out of town, often disappearing as quickly as they came. Stories spread of maids who left without notice, of farmhands who never returned from their work in the fields. And while the Ashfords always had neat explanations and illness, a family emergency locals began to wonder how so many people could vanish without a trace. The manor itself became the subject of legend. Children dared each other to climb the hill at night, swearing they saw lanterns flickering in the windows long after the family was asleep. Hunters claimed to hear the faint sound of crying in the woods that bordered the estate, though when they searched, nothing was found but tangled roots and broken branches. One farmer even claimed that, while passing the estate late one evening, he heard the distinct sound of chains dragging across stone, echoing from within the walls. Inside the home, not everything was as pristine as it looked. Guests invited to the manor spoke of locked doors and wings of the house that were never opened. Some claimed the basement was sealed, its door bolted shut and guarded by 2 servants at all times. When asked why, Nathaniel Ashford would dismiss the question with a smile, insisting it was simply storage. But locals had other theories, none of them innocent. The estate became a paradox, a symbol of the Ashfords' wealth and dominance, and at the same time, the root of countless superstitions. People feared it, yet they couldn't look away. Whispers of the Ashford estate became part of the town's fabric, the kind of hushed stories parents told their children as warnings. Stay away from the hill, or the Ashfords will take you inside. And perhaps what made the whispers even more powerful was this simple fact: no matter how terrible the rumors became, nobody dared confront the family. The Ashfords' power was untouchable. Their wealth, their influence, and their unyielding silence made the truth impossible to uncover, God at least, until tragedy struck and the perfect facade began to crack. For years, the Ashfords managed to maintain their iron grip on the town. They silenced gossip with donations, crushed rivals with contracts, and cloaked themselves in wealth and influence. But power, no matter how carefully guarded, cannot keep death from knocking at the door. The first blow came in the spring of 1839. Jonathan Ashford, the youngest son of Charles and the pride of the family, suddenly fell ill. At just 19 years old, Jonathan was considered the family's brightest hope, a young man described as charming, ambitious, and eager to carry on the Ashford name. His sudden sickness was explained as a fever, the sort of common ailment that could strike without warning. But those who saw him during his decline whispered of something more sinister. Neighbors recalled how Jonathan wasted away, his skin growing pale and his eyes hollow. One servant, who later fled the estate, claimed Jonathan would wake screaming at night, clawing at his bedsheets as though unseen hands held him down. Within weeks, he was gone. The family ordered a closed casket burial, refusing to allow the town doctor to examine the body. To the public, they presented grief and dignity. But behind closed doors, it was said the Ashfords barely spoke of Jonathan again. The town might have accepted Jonathan's death as tragic misfortune, but whispers quickly began. Some suggested Jonathan had been poisoned by rivals within his own family, perhaps to shift inheritance. Others whispered of something darker, that Jonathan had stumbled upon a secret, something the Ashfords would kill to keep hidden. Whatever the truth, his death marked the beginning of the end of the Ashfords' perfect facade. Not long after, another scandal shook the estate. Catherine Ashford, a cousin who had been visiting from Richmond, vanished during a trip back home. Her carriage was found overturned near the river, the horses still harnessed, but spooked, as if they'd bolted from something unseen. Catherine herself was never found. The Ashfords, with their usual efficiency, declared it a tragic accident. But locals whispered that Catherine had learned too much during her stay, that she had seen things within the manor walls that were never meant to leave. Two tragedies, so close together, were enough to fuel the fire of suspicion. The townsfolk began to call it openly the Ashford curse. Parents warned their children not to wander near the estate. Even church sermons began to include subtle jabs at families who lived in pride and secrecy. Words that everyone knew pointed at the Ashfords. The manor itself seemed to respond to the change. Servants reported hearing footsteps in empty hallways, voices calling their names when no one was there. Visitors spoke of portraits whose eyes seemed to follow them, and of rooms that grew inexplicably cold even in the height of summer. Whether fueled by grief, guilt, or something unexplainable, the shadows in the house grew darker after Jonathan and Catherine's fates. But perhaps most chilling was the Ashfords' response: silence. No public mourning, no memorials, no acknowledgement of the rumors. The family continued to host dinners for politicians and merchants, continued to donate to the church, continued to present themselves as untouchable pillars of the community. It was as if Jonathan and Catherine had been erased, their names spoken only in whispers by those brave enough to remember. Still, the cracks were there. And with each tragedy, the whispers grew louder. The Ashford name, once a symbol of wealth and power, was becoming something else entirely. A warning. By the early 1840s, the Ashfords had lost their illusion of perfection. The family still held wealth, still commanded respect in the courts and churches, but beneath it all, whispers of a curse grew louder with each passing season. The townsfolk gave it a name: the Ashford curse. It wasn't spoken with laughter, but with genuine fear. People believed that misfortune clung to the family like ivy to stone, creeping into every life that touched theirs. Farmers near the estate began reporting strange happenings. Livestock would fall sick and die overnight, their bodies untouched by predators, yet rigid and cold by morning. Crops withered at the edge of Ashford lands, as though the soil itself refused to nourish anything that bordered their property. Mothers claimed their children returned home from playing near the Ashford woods, pale and feverish, muttering about voices in the trees. But the most damning whispers came from the servants, the few who dared to leave the Ashford household alive. One young maid, who fled to a neighboring county, left behind a letter now preserved in a local archive. In it, she wrote, "I have seen what no Christian should ever see. The master walks the grounds at night, with lantern in hand, speaking to shadows as if they answer. The youngest heir was locked in the cellar for 3 days, and when they brought him out, he could not look at the sun without screaming. I beg you, do not let your daughters near that house." Though some dismissed the letter as hysteria, others swore it confirmed what they already suspected. Church leaders began hinting at godless rituals during sermons. A visiting preacher, after staying in town for a week, openly declared the Ashfords were a family marked by sin. But even he stopped short of naming specifics, because to accuse the Ashfords directly was to invite their wrath, superstitions took root. Locals carried charms when passing the estate, at night iron nails in their pockets, sprigs of rosemary in their hats. They told their children never to whistle on the hill, for fear it would call the attention of the Ashfords' restless dead. Hunters avoided the woods near the manor altogether, claiming the trees grew too close together there, as if the forest itself was trying to trap them. As stories spread, they grew darker. Some said the Ashfords had struck a bargain generations ago, trading loyalty to darker forces for their wealth. Others believed the family practiced old-world rituals brought over from Europe, secret rites that demanded blood sacrifices. The truth, if there was one, remained hidden behind the manor's stone walls. But the absence of clarity only fueled imagination, and soon the curse became as real to the people of the valley as the church bell that tolled every Sunday. What's most chilling is how misfortune seemed to ripple outward. Families who did business with the Ashfords often reported hardship soon after. A merchant who secured a contract with Nathaniel Ashford lost his wife to sudden illness. A schoolteacher who accepted funds from the estate was later found dead in his study, his papers burned to ash. These coincidences may have been nothing more than cruel chance, but in a town already gripped by superstition, they were taken as proof. By the time a decade had passed, the Ashford name had transformed. Once a mark of prestige, it was now spoken with unease, a name people lowered their voices to utter. The family still walked proudly through church doors and town halls, but behind their backs the whispers grew. The Ashfords were no longer just a wealthy dynasty. They had become something else, something feared. And when fear grips a town, it is only a matter of time before it turns to anger. By the mid-19th century, the Ashford name had become less a symbol of pride and more a warning. Behind the iron gates, their wealth and power remained intact, but the shadows around the family grew thicker. For years, townsfolk whispered that something catastrophic was coming, that no dynasty, so steeped in misfortune and fear, could stand forever. And in time, they were proven right. It began with a fire. On a stormy night in 1857, smoke was seen rising from the Ashford estate. Witnesses claimed the flames seemed to erupt all at once, racing through the manor's west wing with unnatural speed. Some swore they heard screams carried down the hill on the wind screams that didn't sound entirely human. By the time neighbors reached the gates, the estate was already engulfed. Rain fell in sheets, but the fire raged on as though the storm itself had no power against it. Several members of the family perished that night. Historical records mention Nathaniel Ashford and his wife among the dead, their bodies recovered from the charred remains at the library. Others, including 2 children, were never found. Whether they escaped into the woods or burned within the house remains a mystery. What is certain is that the Ashford dynasty never recovered from that night. But here is where the tragedy becomes something stranger. Survivors who fled the estate did not stay in Virginia. Instead, they scattered across the country, some as far as New England, others into the western frontier. Within a generation, the Ashford name had all but vanished, replaced with new surnames, altered identities, and a silence that would last for decades. It was as if the survivors were not just running from the fire, but from their own bloodline. The estate itself was left in ruin. Charred stone walls stood like blackened ribs against the sky, their interiors gutted by fire. Windows shattered, the roof caved in, the manor became a husk of its former grandeur. And yet, even in ruin, it remained a place of fear. Children dared each other to climb the hill and peer through its skeletal frame. They told stories of hearing voices inside, of doors creaking shut when no wind blew, of ghostly figures glimpsed through broken windows. Few stayed long enough to find out if the stories were true. For the town, the collapse of the Ashfords was a relief, but not a clean one. The family's wealth had funded schools, roads, even the church. Their sudden disappearance left gaps in the community, but no one stepped forward to mourn them. Instead, people shook their heads and muttered that justice had finally been done, that the curse had claimed its final victims. The story didn't end there. Strange reports followed in the years after the fire. A group of surveyors, sent to map the land for possible sale, claimed to find locked doors still standing within the ruins doors that opened onto nothing but empty air, as though entire rooms had vanished. A hunter swore he saw a child's shoe half buried in the ash, still warm to the touch years after the blaze. And one farmer, passing by at dusk, insisted he saw a figure standing in a window of the ruined manor, watching him with burning eyes. The Ashfords may have collapsed as a family, but their presence lingered in the ruins, heavy and inescapable. What burned that night was not just a house, but the final mask that had hidden the family's sins. And in its place stood a monument to their legacy, a blackened skeleton of stone and smoke, whispering to anyone who dared draw near. The fire may have reduced the Ashford estate to ash and rubble, but it did not silence the whispers. In many ways, the family's collapse only deepened the legend, giving birth to stories that stretched far beyond the valley. What had once been rumor became folklore, and what had once been fear became something darker, a curse that seemed determined never to die. In the decades following the fire, the ruins of Ashford Manor became a place of both fascination and terror. Farmers avoided the hill, saying their animals grew restless when grazing too close. Travelers reported seeing lights flickering inside the hollowed windows, as if lanterns still burned in rooms that no longer existed. Children dared each other to run up the winding road at dusk, only to flee back down, swearing they heard voices calling from the shadows. By the late 1800s, the legend had spread beyond the county. Paranormal investigators of the era, what few existed, visited the site. Documenting strange accounts of cold drafts, disembodied footsteps, and the smell of smoke lingering in the air on clear nights. One investigator even claimed to have found a journal buried beneath the rubble, its pages half burned, but still legible. In it were fragments of what appeared to be servant records, detailing punishments, disappearances, and orders given directly by Nathaniel Ashford himself. The journal was said to vanish soon after, purchased by a private collector who refused to release it. Locals took this as proof that not everything about the Ashfords had been destroyed. Some believed that their descendants scattered across the country were still working quietly to erase traces of the family's sins. Indeed, whispers persisted that the Ashford bloodline had survived, though under different names. Genealogists in the 20th century uncovered hints of families in New England, Ohio, and even as far as California, whose roots could be traced back to the Virginia Ashfords. But when approached, these families either denied the connection outright or abruptly cut off contact. The idea of the curse lived on. Stories were told of Ashford descendants who suffered sudden tragedies, accidents, illnesses, unexplained deaths. A woman in Massachusetts claimed her grandfather had confessed on his deathbed that he was an Ashford by birth, and that he had spent his life outrunning the shadow of the family. When asked what he meant, she said he only muttered one word before passing: blood. Even in modern times, the ruins draw curious visitors. Ghost hunters set up cameras and EVP recorders, often reporting chilling results. Faint voices calling names, the sound of dragging chains, even screams that seem to rise from beneath the earth. Photographs taken at the site sometimes show hazy figures standing in the windows, even though the upper floors collapsed long ago. And nearly every account mentions the same detail, the feeling of being watched. But perhaps the most unsettling part of the Ashford legacy is how locals treat it even today. Generations later, residents of the nearby town still refuse to speak the family name after dark. Children are warned not to play near the hill, and older folks insist that those who mock the curse invite disaster into their homes. To them, the Ashfords are not a story of the past. They are a presence, alive in the land itself, a reminder that some secrets refuse to be buried. The Ashford family may have collapsed into ruin, but their shadow lingers. Whether you believe in curses or not, one fact remains clear. The Ashfords left behind more than scorched stone. They left behind a story so heavy, so haunted, that even silence cannot kill it. When we look back at the story of the Ashfords, one thing becomes clear. Wealth can build walls, but it cannot silence whispers. For generations, the Ashfords tried to control their legacy through power, through fear, through secrets locked behind iron gates. Yet in the end, it wasn't their riches that endured. It was their sins. The ruined estate still stands as a reminder of what happens when shadows outgrow the light. Families rise and fall every generation, but few leave behind a presence so thick, so heavy, that it feels alive centuries later. Whether you believe in curses or simply in the consequences of cruelty, the Ashfords are proof that the past has a way of reaching forward, clawing at those who think it buried. Even now, long after the fire has faded and their bloodline has scattered, their secrets refuse to die. Perhaps it's in the ruined walls where explorers claim to hear footsteps. Perhaps it's in the trembling voices of locals who warn children away from the hill. Or perhaps it lingers in the very name itself, Ashford, a name once meant to command respect, now spoken only in whispers. And maybe that's the truest curse of all, to be remembered, not for greatness or honor, but for the shadows you leave behind. Not so. I leave you with a question. Do you believe the Ashfords were victims of coincidence, destroyed by their own cruelty and ambition? Or do you believe there really was something darker at work, a curse that followed their bloodline from the cradle to the grave? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one, and your theories keep these forgotten stories alive. And if you want to hear more tales like this, stories that history tried to bury, but the shadows refuse to let go of, make sure you like this video, share it with a friend who loves a good mystery, and subscribe to the channel, because the Ashfords are not the only family with a dark legacy. And in the weeks to come, we'll uncover more of the horrors that history tried and failed to erase. Until then, remember this: walls may crumble, names may fade, but whispers never die.